The Psycho is a scary story about a girl who starts dating a new guy. Her friends tell her there is something wrong with him, but she ignores their warnings. My name is Dasha and I want to tell you a story about my last boyfriend. We met at university. We accidentally bumped into each other in the hallway. He asked me to go for coffee with him and I agreed. He told me his name was Norman. We talked about this and that. He was handsome and witty. I was very attracted to him and before long, we were dating. Norman was very sensitive and caring guy, not like my previous boyfriends. It was like he was from another planet. He was always interested in what I wanted, always concerned about my needs, but at the same time he was very masculine. I felt safe with him. Everything was fine at first. It was my friend's birthday and our whole group gathered in a bar to celebrate. I was excited because I brought Norman and I wanted to introduce him to everyone. Sitting at the table, we were having fun, drinking and laughing. Then some of the guys went outside to smoke and Norman went with them. They were gone for 5 minutes and when they returned, I was approached by my friend Simon. Dasha, I think there's something wrong with this Norman guy, he said. What do you mean? I asked. Well, he's kind of strange. He started talking about his mother, saying really weird things. Then he started giggling like an idiot for no reason. He's not normal, Norman? Not normal? Are you sure? I said. Of course, I spoke with Norman about it, but he denied everything. He said my guy friends were just jealous of our relationship and they were trying to drive a wedge between us. I believed him, especially since Simon had asked me out on a date one time and I had to turn him down. It was possible that he just wanted to turn me against Norman and get rid of his competition. But the more time I spent with Norman, the more I started to notice some strange behavior. Sometimes, he would get a faraway look in his eyes and go silent for a few minutes. Then he would start talking again as if nothing had happened. And he began to call me Mommy. I put up with his little eccentricities, because everything else in the relationship was wonderful. And then something happened. It was like a bolt from the blue. One day, he kidnapped me. We at my house and my parents were out. I went upstairs to get something. All of a sudden, I felt him grab me from behind and he put a handkerchief over my nose and mouth. It was soaked in some kind of chemical and within seconds, I blacked out. When I woke up, I was in some shabby apartment with a dirty rag stuffed in my mouth. My arms and legs were tied to the bed and I had a terrible headache. Norman came in. He put his finger to his lips and pulled the rag from my mouth. I immediately screamed and Norman slapped me across the face really hard. Don't you dare cry, he growled. My mother never cried. Okay? He untied my hands and gave me a withering look. He told me that if I tried to run away, things would only get worse. Norman took me into the kitchen and sat me down at the table. He put a plate of food in front of me and told me to eat. All this time, he did not take his eyes off me for a second, so I just did as I was told. When I looked into Norman's eyes, I could see he was a complete psycho. How could I have not seen this in him before? He smiled at me, as if everything was normal. How are things at work, Mommy? He asked. I had no other choice but to play along with him. All good, I replied. So, we'll go on holiday together next week? Of course, I mumbled. Oh, by the way, someone told me you have a new man in your life, Mommy. That's not true, is it? You wouldn't do that to me, would you, Mommy? I saw how angrily he was staring at me. No, I replied. Well, I knew it wasn't true, he grinned. We don't need anybody else. We're happy together, just me and you. After I finished eating, he took me into the bedroom and forced me onto the bed. He tied my hands, put a gag in my mouth and left. This was how my nightmare began. Sometimes Norman remained with me for a long time, telling me how things were going in college. He always called me Mom or Mommy. I went along with it, because I was afraid of what he might do if I resisted. If I made one mistake, he would beat me terribly. I was stuck in that dingy apartment for 6 whole days. My room was always locked and there was no clock, so I had to guess what time it was. Norman would come and go. I don't know where he got the money, but he always brought me food and sweets. He said, "I love my mother and I want to make her happy." A boy's best friend is his mother. I knew that this couldn't go on. My parents and my friends were probably worried sick. I wondered if they had contacted the police already. I wondered if anyone was looking for me. One time, I tried to reason with him. I tried to explain that I was not his mother and he needed to let me go, but he beat me again like crazy. On the 6th day, Norman woke me up as usual and told me he was going out to buy us breakfast. I heard the front door close and I started trying to free myself. I felt that I could move my right hand a little. The ropes were not very tight. It took about 20 minutes, but I managed to work it free. I quickly untied myself and rushed to the door, but of course, I was firmly locked. I looked out the window. I was on the 5th floor. I grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. With a loud crash, the glass broke and the chair landed on the pavement outside, almost hitting some passers-by. Leaning out the window, I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Help me! He's going to kill me! Help! He's a psycho!" And then I saw him. Norman was standing in the street with a bag in his hand, glaring up at me. By the look in his eyes, I knew the only thing he wanted now was to kill me. People were gathering under the window, so my crazy boyfriend just turned and ran off. 10 minutes later, a police car arrived. The officers broke down the door and rescued me. I will never forget the look in my parents' eyes when they took me home. I spent the rest of the night weeping uncontrollably. It turned out that the police were already looking for Norman. He was on the run from the authorities long before he met me. He was wanted for a double murder. His name wasn't even Norman, it was Ed, and he was actually 30 years old. He had a history of mental illness and had been in and out of insane asylums for most of his life. 2 years before, he had been living with his mother. He was completely obsessed with her. His mother was dating a man and she brought him home with her one night. When Norman caught them together, he flew into a violent rage. He beat both of them to death with a hammer and then just disappeared. I hope the police will find him soon, because until they do, I am too scared to leave my house. If you want my advice, be careful who you date. Pink Hearts is a scary story about a teenage girl who starts to receive love notes from a secret admirer. Each one is sealed with a distinctive heart sticker and she begins to wonder who her secret admirer could be. When I was 13 years old, my parents moved to the city and I started attending a new school. I was very shy at that age and I didn't have any friends. It took me a while to fit in. The other girls seemed much more mature than I was. A lot of them seemed to have boyfriends and I had never even kissed a boy before. I wasn't really used to any kind of male attention at all. Whenever a guy smiled or winked at me, I was either extremely embarrassed or convinced that he was playing some kind of joke on me. I never thought of myself as beautiful and couldn't believe that any guy would really find me attractive. Then, one day, I found a note in my locker. It was a small, blue envelope, sealed with a little pink heart sticker. Inside was a piece of paper. It simply read, "I think you're beautiful." I was genuinely touched. It was so sweet and innocent. I wondered who had sent it, but I didn't really have any idea how to go about finding out. I stuck the love note between the pages of one of my school books and began to daydream about my new secret admirer. Could it be the cute boy who let me borrow his pencil in maths class? Or was it my lab partner, who always made me blush bright red when he smiled at me? Perhaps it was the boy in my history class who shared his book with me when I forgot to bring mine. Or maybe it was the tall, brooding guy in the year above me who wrote poetry and spent most of his time riding motorcycles. I was as excited as any other teenage girl, filled with dreams of puppy love, holding hands, and maybe a first kiss. Whenever I was feeling sad, I took the note out and read it again. It always made me smile. A few days later, I opened my locker and discovered another note. It was in a small purple envelope and was sealed with the same little pink heart. Trembling with excitement and anticipation, I carefully peeled it open and unfolded the paper inside. It read, "You're so lovely." I held the note to my chest and sighed with delight. For the rest of the day, I walked through the school hallways with a goofy grin plastered all over my face. Finally, someone really liked me. It made me feel so special, I wanted to scream it from the rooftops. Of course, I was too embarrassed to tell anyone and kept it all to myself, tucking the notes safely into my school journal. I spent the next few days trying to figure out who my secret admirer could be, but I didn't have a clue. Obviously, I knew that it had to be someone in my school, but who? All I could do was hope it was someone I really did like. A week later, there was another small envelope waiting in my locker. It was sealed with the same pink heart. It read, "I am thinking about you always." As time went on, I couldn't contain my curiosity. I started daydreaming in class and stopped paying attention. One day, during history class, I was so busy thinking about my secret admirer that I didn't realize the teacher had asked me a question. When I snapped back to reality, the teacher turned to the rest of the class and said, "She's not listening to a word I'm saying. She must be in love." They all burst out laughing and I was so embarrassed, I went bright red. When the next love note appeared in my locker, it read, "You smell like love itself." Huh? I didn't know how to take that. I actually smelled like a combination of shampoo and deodorant. Is that what love smells like? I tucked the note away with the others and waited eagerly for the next one. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, there was another envelope with the telltale pink heart. It read, "I want to taste you." That was kind of creepy. The next note was even creepier. It read, "I am watching you always." Suddenly, having a secret admirer didn't seem like so much fun anymore. He was beginning to sound like a stalker. I didn't know what to do. There was nobody I could talk to about it. As the days passed, my sense of uneasiness began to grow. I started to see pink heart stickers everywhere. It was beginning to freak me out. In the morning, when my mother drove me to school, there was one stuck to the windscreen of our car. She didn't know where it had come from. Once, after I went to the toilet in school, I came back out and was washing my hands at the sink. In the mirror, I noticed a pink heart on the stall door. I was sure it hadn't been there when I went inside, and I hadn't heard anyone come into the toilet while I was there. It got to the point where I dreaded seeing one of those pink heart stickers. I was a nervous wreck, but I was afraid to confide in anyone. So, I did the only thing a painfully awkward and embarrassed teenage girl could do. I suffered in silence. Then, things got really bad. One day, I came home from school and was horrified to see a plain white envelope had arrived in the mail. It was sealed with one of the dreaded pink hearts. Now, he knew where I lived. With trembling hands, I peeled off the sticker and opened the envelope. Inside, there was a picture. A picture of a grown man, naked from the waist up. In his right hand, he was holding a knife. There was a note too. It read, "I bet your blood tastes like strawberries." I screamed. Then, I noticed something in the photo that filled me with horror. The man had taken a picture of his reflection in the mirror, but he had obscured his face. However, he had forgotten to cover his tracks. Reflected in the mirror was a framed picture, hanging on the wall behind him. Worst of all, I recognized the man in the framed picture. It was my history teacher. Psychic ability is a scary riddle about a homeless man and the strange things he says. Read the story carefully and think about it for a while. Try and figure out what the hidden meaning is. I live in Osaka, Japan, and often use the subway to go to work in the morning. One day, when I was waiting for the train, I noticed a homeless man standing in a corner of the subway station, muttering to himself as people passed by. He was holding out a cup and seemed to be begging for spare change. A fat woman passed by the homeless man and I distinctly heard him say, "Pig." Wow, I thought to myself. This homeless man is insulting people and he still expects them to give him money? Then a tall businessman went by and the homeless guy muttered, "Human." Human? I couldn't argue with that. Obviously, he was a human. The next day, I arrived early at the subway station and had some time to kill, so I decided to stand close to the homeless man and listen to his strange mutterings. A thin, haggard-looking man passed in front of him and I heard the homeless guy mutter, "Cow." Cow? I thought. The man was much too skinny to be a cow. He looked more like a turkey or a chicken to me. A minute or so later, a fat man went by and the homeless man said, "Potato." Potato? I was under the impression that he called all fat people pig. That day, at work, I couldn't stop thinking about the homeless man and his puzzling behavior. I kept trying to find some logic or pattern in what he was muttering. Perhaps he has some kind of psychic ability, I thought. Maybe he knows what these people were in a previous life. In Japan, many people believe in reincarnation. I observed the homeless man many times and began to think my theory was right. I often heard him calling people things like rabbit or onion or sheep or tomato. One day, curiosity got the better of me and I decided to ask him what was going on. As I walked up to him, he looked at me and said, "Bread." I tossed some money into his cup and asked him if he had some kind of psychic ability. The homeless man smiled and said, "Yes, indeed. I do have a psychic ability. It is an ability I obtained years ago. But it is not what you might expect. I can't tell the future or read minds or anything like that." "Then what is your ability?" I asked eagerly. "The ability is merely to know the last thing somebody ate," he said. I laughed because I realized he was right. He said bread. The last thing I had eaten for breakfast that day was toast. I walked away shaking my head. Of all the psychic abilities someone could have, that one must be the most useless. Did you notice the horror of this story? The Girl in the Photograph is a creepy story about a boy who finds a picture of a beautiful girl and becomes obsessed with her. One day, a boy was sitting in his classroom in school. He was extremely bored and was waiting for the school bell to ring. When he looked out the window, something caught his eye. There was a photograph lying on the grass outside. When school was over, he ran outside and picked up the photograph before anyone else had a chance to see it. Turning it over in his hands, he realized it was a picture of an incredibly beautiful girl. She was wearing a white top, a short, black skirt, black tights and black shoes. For some reason, she was holding up 2 fingers. The girl was so pretty that he wanted to meet her. He showed the photograph to everyone in the school and asked if they knew her. Unfortunately, nobody recognized her. That night, when he went to bed, he placed the photo on his bedside table and went to sleep. Around midnight, he woke up. There was something tapping on his window. Then he heard what sounded like someone giggling. More than a little frightened, he worked up the courage to investigate it. He jumped out of bed, went over to the window and opened it. There was nothing there. The next day, he showed the photo to his friends and neighbors and asked if they knew the mysterious girl. Everybody he asked said they had never seen the girl before in their lives. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard the tapping sound again. He looked out the window and could just make out a figure standing on the other side of the street. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like the mysterious girl in the photograph. Clutching the picture tightly, he threw on his clothes and raced downstairs and out the front door. As he crossed the road, he forgot to look both ways and was suddenly hit by a car. The driver got out of the car and ran over to help the boy, but it was no use. The boy had been killed on impact. The driver noticed something clutched in the boy's hand. It was a photograph. Turning it over in his hands, the driver realized it was a picture of an incredibly beautiful girl. She was wearing a black top, a short, black skirt, black tights and black shoes. For some reason, she was holding up 3 fingers. The Twist ending is a spooky short story with a plot twist at the end. There was a very famous author named David, who had written quite a few best-selling horror novels. All of the literary critics praised his talent for plot twists and surprise endings. He received a large amount of fan mail every day, and some budding authors even sent him manuscripts in the hopes that he would help them get their work published. While David took pleasure in responding to letters from his fans, he took even more pleasure in stealing the ideas of amateur writers. If he came across a manuscript with a great idea for a scary story, he would use it in one of his own books and deny the author any credit. Then, in order to hide his theft, he pulled some strings with his friends in the publishing industry to make sure that the original author never got anything published in the future. One day, David received a new manuscript in the mail. It was bound in a beautiful hardcover book. He read the first chapter and felt that he knew how the story would end. As he continued reading, he became more and more certain that he could guess the twist ending. It was growing late, but he wanted to finish reading the manuscript to see whether or not he was right. When David came to the final chapter, he realized that the last few pages of the book were stuck together. Anxious to read further, he pulled the pages apart. He felt increasingly tired, but he still kept reading. Finally, he came to the end of the book. It was exactly the twist ending he had anticipated. The husband had hanged himself just as his wife was committing suicide in the next room. David made a mental note to steal the idea and use it in his next story. Just then, he noticed that, after the words "the end," there was a little handwritten comment from the author. It read, "I already know that you are planning to steal the ideas in this story. I know, because you did the exact same thing to me the last time I sent you a manuscript. You published it under your own name and didn't give me any credit. You ripped me off and blacklisted me in the industry. Nobody will accept my novels anymore, and I will never again be able to publish anything I write. You have ruined my life, and now I am going to have my revenge. You had to pull apart the back pages in order to read this, didn't you? Well, those pages contained a poison. Arsenic, to be precise. Are you feeling tired? That is normal. It's one of the symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Soon, your heartbeat will get slower and slower until it eventually stops permanently. Don't bother trying to call an ambulance. You will be dead before they arrive. You have already been exposed for too long. Goodbye, David." Some twist endings can be very hard to predict. Sounds is a true ghost story about a haunted house in Mobile, Alabama called the Madison Mansion. 3 men who try to stay the night in the old place hear terrifying noises and see something that chills them to the bone. A long time ago, there was a house that stood on the bay near Mobile, Alabama. It was known as the Madison Mansion, and it had been vacant and boarded up for years. Most people in the area kept well away from it, frightened by its uncanny reputation. Anyone who passed by couldn't help wondering what evil had transpired in the old place. Trespassers who dared to enter the old house usually fled during the night, telling tales so grisly that they were almost beyond belief. One night, 3 fishermen were caught in a quick-moving storm and managed to make their way back to shore. Drenched by the rain, they spotted the mansion and decided to take shelter in the rickety old place. Once inside, they made a fire in the fireplace to keep themselves warm and ate a cold supper. Then, the 3 men pulled their oilskin coats tightly around them and lay down on the floor to try and get some sleep. However, as soon as they dozed off, they were plagued by terrible nightmares of treachery and murder. Lying awake, the men heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. It sounded like more than one person, marching back and forth. "Who's there?" called one of the fishermen. The footsteps suddenly stopped. They heard a woman scream. The scream turned into a groan and died away. The house was quiet again. Just then, the man who had called out felt something splash against his forehead. Something was dripping from the ceiling and forming a small, red puddle on the floor. To their horror, the fishermen realized it was blood. All of a sudden, a door upstairs crashed open and the floor shook with the sound of heavy footsteps. It sounded like a woman was being chased by a man. The frightened fishermen heard disembodied voices in the darkness. A man shouted in anger. A woman cried out in pain. They heard objects being flung here and there with a crash. Long howls of horrible laughter rose and filled the house. It went on and on until the fishermen thought they would go mad. Then, there was silence. The fishermen huddled together and listened. After a few minutes, they heard something coming down the stairs. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy that bumped on each rotten step. The scraping and thumping noises came through the front hall and the front door opened. It sounded like something was flung outside, landing with a thump among the weeds. Then the door slammed shut and again, there was silence. There was a thunderstorm outside and the house trembled as if it was about to collapse. Rain was pounding against the sagging walls. The terrified fishermen couldn't bear to stay in the place a moment longer and decided to flee. Just as they reached the door, a flash of lightning filled every room in the house with a green blaze, and one of the men saw a ghastly face staring at them from the stairs. It was so horrible that it looked as if it came from hell itself. A crash of thunder deafened the terrified men and they ran out into the storm, never to return. Nobody ever knew for sure what terrible deeds had been done in that house. The mansion was built shortly after the American Revolution by an Englishman named Madison, who was a rich recluse. He lived there with his daughter, who was said to be mentally ill. Nobody ever saw her, and the servants were kept well away from her. They never had any visitors and never went out. One day, without a word of warning, Madison suddenly left for England and wrote to his servants, instructing them to sell the house. The daughter was never found. She just disappeared. After that, the house changed hands many times, but nobody could ever stay there for long.